close. So my name is Phil Rubinstein, and I'll just be moderating with some various comments throughout. And the program, well, first of all, this is part of a series of conferences and meetings across the United States, as well as in South America, Europe, and so forth. For example, sponsored by the Schiller Institute, which was founded by Helga Zepp-LaRouche on an international scale. Also, you could say co-sponsored by the Political Action Committee, or at least many members of it are involved in this. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche called for this series of conferences internationally. Like today, we have a conference in New York, which is probably our major event of the day. We have a conference in Seattle, up in the Northwest. We have today's conference here, and I believe we have one in Philadelphia. Last week we had other events. Well, the event in Manhattan is actually a sing-along on Handel's Messiah. One of the characteristics of the Schiller Institute is the conception that science and classical art operate on the same principle, the same idea, the same conception, and that all great science is, in a sense, generated by the creative insight of classical art. Typically, the best example is classical music, the music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and a few others. What prompted this series of conferences is that, in particular, in the middle of July, well, two things. Xi Jinping, the president of China, announced that the economic policy of China was the new Silk Road. This idea of a great infrastructure project, which you'll see, it'll be the main presentation of the first panel. A great infrastructure project, in a sense, covering the same territory as the Silk Road of the 12th, 13th centuries, the road from China across to Europe. That there's a modern version of the Silk Road, which involves the joining of the total capability of the populations of the Eurasian landmass, which of course is the largest landmass on the globe. It's the largest population in the globe, and it portends the greatest development. Now, that was the project that Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche promoted after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s as the counterpoint to the Cold War and to the effort to subordinate the former Soviet republics, Russia, and so on and so forth. That was the peace policy, somewhat in the tradition of Pope Paul VI, peace through development. So this was now stated as the official policy of China about 6 months ago, though this had been percolating for a while. And since then, Helga LaRouche has been interviewed numerous times. In fact, if you go, I think, to the Xinhua or the CCTV website and just punch in Silk Road as the search name, the first half a dozen items that show up are Helga being interviewed by CCTV, the People's Daily News, Xinhua, Global Times, and you know, a number of the broad distribution media of China today. Now, that was followed July the 15th by a meeting of what's referred to as the BRICS. Now, you have to, the BRICS are 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, these 5 countries represent a good chunk of the world population. India and China alone are about close to 40% of the world population. So this represents over 40%, obviously, of the world population. And these are the dynamic progressive forces on the in the globe today. Now, at that July 15th conference, they adopted, the BRICS as a whole, adopted the Silk Road and even the World Land Bridge Development Project. That this is the unifying principle, not just in terms of infrastructure, but as you'll see later in the day, led by a science driver policy, typified by China and India in their space programs, the venture to the moon, the Indian observer sent to Mars, and so forth. Quite apart from the way most Americans think of this. Probably the most advanced space program in history is now being developed by China, followed by India. Russia is joining in at a certain level. The US space program is degenerating. The fact of the matter is, to put it simply to Americans, we are no longer #1. Not only in space, but in a lot of areas, but in particular in space. Yeah, we would have a great role to play joined with others. But by ourselves, we simply are not what we once were. So, you know, this policy was adopted as a world land bridge. And I'm going to refer to this, you'll see parts of this. This was circulated, it's called the New Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge, and is circulating globally at government levels, institutional, scientific levels, and among the general population to the degree possible. We do also have a pamphlet that's a shorter version that focuses on the BRICS, why the United States must join the BRICS. And we are saying to the American population that the only solution to the collapse of the US economy, the domination of Wall Street, is to adopt this kind of grand, great development project as partners with the rest of the population of the globe, with the leading countries. That is, as Xi Jinping has called it, this is a win-win strategy. It's not a zero-sum game, where if China improves, we must lose. If Russia puts itself together, that hurts us. That's not real development. For us, really, the development of China, of India, of Africa, would represent a benefit in that the skill levels that we would like to achieve would be demanded by the development of other countries as they themselves develop their own population. So we are on a, because the world faces two things I'll reference just later. I think Helga has this. But the world faces two things. The crash of the existing dominant financial system. That is the so-called transatlantic. Wall Street and London. What really is the remnant of the British Empire. You know, to a certain degree, the United States has been recolonized. The second threat, which is a consequence of the first, is the threat of global general warfare or even thermonuclear warfare. Not confrontation, warfare. And I think a lot of Americans just don't, as they say on the street, they just don't cop it. You know, they just don't recognize that these kinds of wars can happen, have happened, and if we don't pay attention, will happen. You can say that the American population, in a certain sense, since the Civil War, that's a long time ago, you know, 150 years ago, and we still have a lot of Confederacy in the United States. But we haven't experienced warfare the way Europe did in World War I and World War II, or Russia in World War II in particular. We don't know what that means. We think it's something that happens 6,000 miles away. And we may offer some sacrifices, but we don't go through the same thing. And now we're faced with the threat of all-out general warfare. Now, if we can avoid those two threats, we have something for the future of humanity that it would be the best we've ever done. We're in a position to develop the globe. We have the potential scientific development. We have leading nations in the world committed to it. But we have to get the United States and a good chunk of Europe over the idea that the gains of somebody else is a loss to me. Get over the worship of money. Now, we are circulating a petition, which is also back, but this is being circulated internationally. The title of it is "The U.S. and Europe Must Have the Courage to Reject Geopolitics and Collaborate with the BRICS." The first paragraph, "In today's nuclear age, the consequence of the geopolitical policy of confrontation with Russia and China can only be the thermonuclear extinction of the human race. Therefore, every effort must be made to cooperate to solve the multiple crises facing humanity. The BRICS nations have united to pursue a policy of economic development, not just for their individual countries, but for the benefit of all." And I'm not going to obviously read the whole thing. "As patriots of our nation and as citizens of the world, we call on our fellow citizens and the leaders of our nations to have the courage to break the current cycle of escalating bestiality by accepting the generous offer to collaborate with the BRICS." And then it calls, now we do have a number of important signers internationally and in the United States, and we want this to build. This has been posted on websites in China, covered in the major media. It's being picked up on some significant websites in the United States, and we want to spread that. It's worth noting that in Germany, 60 leading German figures, including former Chancellor Schroeder, had an ad in Die Zeit which said, you know, essentially no more wars in Europe. Warning of the threat of war over the Ukraine crisis in that case. So this is not just an alternative, it's an active solution. The one thing I'll underline, it will be covered, this is going on. The rail projects across Eurasia, the space program of China and India. These are not could happen, might happen. They are happening. They are a fact. And the real question is, will the United States have the sense to join them? Now we're going to begin with a musical offering. We'll have music at different parts of the program. We'll start with the musical offering, and then we'll have a message from Helga LaRouche. I'll make some comments after that. We have a presentation by a guest from Liberia, the Honorable Samuel Hoffman, the president of the Liberian American Committee of Southern California. And he'll speak to this situation. And then we'll have a presentation on the World Land Bridge, and that'll be the first panel. Okay? So is the music ready?
Just, no. First, what we're going to start with is called "The Battle Cry of Freedom," which was a famous song during the Civil War. And in the sense of Alexander Hamilton, the founder of the Hamiltonian system that the BRICS represents, we're going to give this offering. You all should have the words in front of you, and we're going to sing it through all 4 verses, but on the 4th verse, we'll sing it again, and you're welcome to join us. Everybody ready?
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the stars, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle
shall be a slave.
Shouting the battle cry of freedom, the Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. So we're springing to the call from the east and from the west, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll hurl the rebel crew from the land we love the best, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. So we're springing to the call from the east and from the west, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll hurl the rebels through from the land we love the best, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Let me just mention one thing. We're going to go through the panel and then take a short question and answer, and hopefully at the end we'll take a longer period. Otherwise, without further ado, as they say, this is Helga Zepp LaRouche. This is a message she sent for all of these meetings across the country.
Dear participants of the Dubna conference, I think you are all aware that the world is at an extremely dangerous moment, and that if the present policies of the US government, the British, NATO and the EU were to be continued, that a thermonuclear war in all likelihood would occur and would lead to the extinction of civilization. I think it is clear that both the Russian and the Chinese government are fully aware of this danger. And if you listen to the speech President Putin gave, his annual speech to the both houses of the Russian Federation, he said one thing which I think is absolutely clear. It is not about the Ukraine what the present crisis is all about. He emphasized that if they would not have found the Ukraine crisis, they would have found another avenue. And that is exactly what I think is absolutely true. And I'm not saying that, as an opinion, but I'm saying that as somebody who has been actively involved together with Mr. LaRouche since a very long time to try to change the direction of the world towards a peace order for the 21st century. Now, when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, we proposed an economic program which we called the Eurasian Land Bridge, the new Silk Road, which was the idea to connect the population and industrial centers of Europe with those of Asia through so-called development corridors. And in that way, we could have saved the industrial capacity of the former Comecon countries by using these capacities to build up infrastructure development corridors throughout Asia and Europe, and in that way change the conditions of the landlocked areas of the Eurasian continent to provide for a better living standard for all people on this continent. Now, unfortunately, that was not what was the policy of the British and the American governments at that point, because they very clearly said and stated that their aim was at that point to turn Russia from a superpower into a raw material producing third world country. And therefore, they basically applied the first form of warfare, which was the so-called shock therapy. Now, we've followed that very clearly because we had the plan to develop the Eurasian continent, and we saw that the shock therapy was never meant to do anything good to anybody, but it succeeded to reduce the Russian industrial capacities in only 3 years, from 1991 to 1994, to 1/3 of its then existing, of its level from 91. And what this period did, the 90s, the Yeltsin period, I think there are two very important books which describe that. One is from Sergei Glaziev, and the other one is from Professor Menshikov, who was a very dear friend of ours and who unfortunately just passed away. And they both describe that form of warfare as genocide. Now, the present offensive against Russia really began at the end of the 90s with the two Chechen wars, which were financed by Boris Berezovsky from London. Now, also a big role played the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, which was founded by the American neocons in 1999. And among the founding members were Brzezinski, Alexander Haig, Richard Perle, James Woolsey, Robert Kagan, who is still very important in the Obama administration, and he is married to nobody else but Victoria Nuland. And I'm pretty sure that it is that grouping to which President Putin referred in his recent speech when he said that these Chechen terrorists were received on the highest level and they were, who being murderers with blood on their hands, called rebels, freedom fighters, and so forth by these people. Now, the aim already in the 90s, but especially since President Putin came back, was that of regime change in Russia, and also all the East European countries where still remnants of a pro-Russian attitude existed. And the promise not to expand NATO to the borders of Russia obviously were broken. Victoria Nuland, the wife of Robert Kagan and who is now the Deputy Secretary of State in the State Department responsible for Europe and for Eurasia, was bragging in December 2013 that the American government spent $5 billion alone on Ukraine for the color revolution. Now, the Russian military, in the meantime, has clearly defined color revolution as a form of war, even if it's not declared. Also, Foreign Minister Lavrov has clearly stated that sanctions are not a device to change the policy of Russia, but simply to topple President Putin. Now, Putin in his speech said the real aim is the Yugoslavia model for Russia, the dismemberment of the whole state. And it is also clear that the EU association agreement, which started and triggered the Ukraine crisis, was aimed in the same direction because it would have flooded the Russian market with cheap European Union products, destroying important capacities in Russia. Now, the Ukraine crisis was entirely caused by the EU and naturally by their American collaborators and one can say masters, because the so-called Maidan was the colored revolution activists, but this time reinforced through the old Nazi networks dating back to the Bandera period of the Ukrainian Nazis collaborating with the Nazi invasion in the 1940s. And these people were groomed in the entire post-war period by the CIA, by MI6, and by the BND. Then you had the fascist coup on the 21st of February, which again, was heavily controlled and sponsored by Victoria Nuland, who bragged in this famous taped phone conversation that they wanted to put their man Yats into the office. And, so this is entirely a combined warfare, color revolution, NATO expansion to the borders of Russia, sanctions, and therefore, when one listens to the former chief general of the general staff of the Russian army, Yuri Baluyevsky, who believes that the conflict between NATO and Russia is on the way, that it already has begun with an information war, with psychological pressure on the minds of the people, a demonization of Putin and China, by the way, and that military force proper will be only the final stage in this process that we are already seeing today. And when he was asked if he thinks it can be still stopped, he said, "Unfortunately, I believe it is no longer possible. The mechanism has been set in motion. Our adversary's aim has been clearly defined. While we are alive, they will try to prevent Russia from becoming their equal partner militarily or economically." Now, fortunately, that is only one reality. It is real, but there is another one. Since the BRICS conference, the summit in Fortaleza in Brazil this July, a whole completely different world dynamic has been formed by the BRICS countries, who have now inspired many other countries in the world, the Latin American countries, the CELAC, the UNASUR, the APEC countries minus the United States, but also the ASEAN countries, Egypt. Many countries have now started to take optimism from the fact that, centered on the strategic alliance between Russia and China, which was formed in May of this year and then continued through the process of the BRICS, especially after President Xi Jinping put the offer of a new Silk Road on the table, which, by the way, is exactly what we have proposed in '91 with the Eurasian Land Bridge New Silk Road. A complete explosion of optimism has started among many, many countries of the developing sector. New financial institutions are being created or have been created already. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank of the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Bank, the New Silk Road Development Fund, the Bank of the SAARC countries, the South Asian countries. And there is right now a complete change in the dynamic, because many projects which were intimidated by the IMF conditionalities for decades are now being realized. China is helping to build a second Panama Canal in Nicaragua. China is helping to build a transcontinental railway from Brazil to Peru. Nuclear cooperation is occurring between many, many countries. And if you look at the explosion of optimism, which, for example, is occurring in India since Narendra Modi is the Prime Minister, he has promised to build 100 new cities in India, to create 1 million jobs every month for the young people of that country. He has just announced that he will revive the 31 water management projects which were put on ice after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. China has done an economic miracle which is unmatched in the world. China, after the Deng Xiaoping reforms, was able to transform China from a very poor country into an economic miracle, which they accomplished in 30 years, what most countries of the industrialized sector needed 2 centuries for. And with the proposal of the new Silk Road, basically what China is offering is to take that Chinese economic miracle and let every country which wants to do so participate in that effort. Now, after the APEC conference in Beijing recently, Xi Jinping offered to President Obama that the United States and other major countries are all invited to participate in the new Silk Road and into these in these new financial mechanisms. Now, it is my firmest conviction, it is not hopeless that that offer can be taken up. For example, in Germany, you have right now a complete revolt in the industry against the sanctions. Just yesterday, a new advertisement, an appeal to the government and the parliament was issued, signed by 60 important personalities from Schröder to Roman Herzog to Horst Telschik, the former head of the Munich Security Conference, and many others. And this is a reflection, and the title of this appeal, by the way, is War Against Russia, Not in My Name. So there is a resistance, and this is very important, and we have to make sure that the evil deeds of such people as Victoria Nuland are becoming known and that we counter this war propaganda. My husband has called for the removal of Victoria Nuland just to slow down this war machine. But I think the real remedy will only come if we eliminate the real cause for this war, and that is the fact that the transatlantic financial system is about to blow out. The collapse of the oil price is not only hurting Russia and Iran, it is potentially blowing out the entire transatlantic financial system, because the oil companies and the shale oil producers have accumulated $1 trillion debt, which they can only pay if the oil price is anywhere between $80 and $120. So we are looking at a repeat of the secondary mortgage crisis of 2007. Therefore, I believe the only real war avoidance policy is that we get the civilization into a completely new paradigm. We have to stop thinking in terms of geopolitical interests, and we have to define the common aims of mankind. And we have to define the present situation from the future. How do we want mankind to look in 10 years, in 100 years, in 1,000 years? And there the question of joint space exploration and such things will become absolutely crucial. Now, the immediate road to go this way is therefore to take up the offer of President Xi Jinping for the United States and Europe to join the new Silk Road. We have just produced a report which shows the unbelievable amount of projects and things for the future which would change and transform the face of the earth. And I think that this blueprint, the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, is something we absolutely have to make the major issue of discussion as the only alternative to the extinction of civilization. I'm optimistic that we can do it. That a guarantee I don't have, but I think it's worth the effort to try everything possible to change the agenda and to discuss the common aims of mankind. How do we get out of this crisis, and how do we create a world which is worthy of the dignity of man and of the identity of mankind as the only creative species in the universe?
Well, my greetings to the conference. What we face now on a planetary scale is something completely new, something that has never happened before, we hope. Because what has happened now, we are on the brink of bringing together the major nations of the planet, the chief nations of the planet in terms of quantity and so forth. They remain in development, but the development is remarkable, for example, in South America, in elements of Africa, in some elements of Europe, especially in Russia and in some other locations, isolated locations. But the problem is this. We have the British Empire, which is the long-standing enemy of humanity. We have to not only defeat this enemy, we also have to be able to rise to the occasion of bringing the United States, the people of the United States, out of their present misery and disorientation, which is possible, is feasible, it can be done. But the government of the United States, the current government of the United States, is an impossible instrument, and we've got to get rid of most of the elements which are dominating the United States government right now. We also have to emphasize that really what the government of the United States is a branch of the Saudi and British empires, like the empires that are involved in the terror in Asia. So therefore, what we have to think about is the plans that we're going to make or should be making now, which enable the world to take a fresh view of itself. The great nations which have emerged in Asia, in South America, for example, they are great nations and have great potential. But we have to protect the process. We have to eliminate the British Empire. If the British Empire is in power, there is no security. If elements of the United States, which are part of the British Empire, are there, and similar kinds of evil forces, we are in danger of losing everything. The possibility of a thermonuclear war globally is still present. Now, what I'm doing, to make it short, is I'm trying to bring about a dumping of the present United States government, because it's a rotten government and needs to be reformed. You don't need to change the design of the U.S. government. You need to change the composition of the U.S. government, especially in the most recent two major administrations. If that occurs, then I'm sure that the horrors faced by most of the people of the United States and by other nations, those horrors can be defeated. The problem is we have to defeat the enemy which is the force we have to deal with. I'm confident we can do it. I'm confident because I know that there are capabilities in the human mind now which are poorly understood, but capabilities which people of some parts of the world, and as in China, in some degree, special degree, Russia, India, and so forth, and the BRIC nations, that these nations are moving in a direction of self-development, of joint self-development, which can lead to a new conception of the meaning of the human species and of our planet itself. Things lie before us and far in this system. Things lie before us which have never been dreamed by most people on this planet. But if we are fortunate, we are actually a few steps in scientific progress toward the greatest leap that mankind has ever defined. For example, we know that mankind is not an animal, and no animal is mankind. We know other things about life and things of so forth, which are essential to be known. We see what's happening in China, in the development of the space exploration there. This is a revolution which takes us in the direction of the stars. And other nations will take the same course and follow the same course that is being done in China in this way. And that's what we have to hope for. It's not just hope, it's an understanding of what the great opportunities are and the great dangers are which we lie before us. For example, we right now have this woman who is leading and controlling part of Central Europe from the United States, an evil person. This person must be removed from the United States and by the United States. And things like that must occur. But my point is, I see a clear point of optimism, a clear opportunity of greatness. What we have to do is just simply build on that, understand the actions we have to take, understand the preparations we have to make. We are on the verge of the potential of the greatest advantage and progress of mankind which has ever been known. And we have to fight now to make sure we secure that advantage for the sake of the future of mankind as mankind goes out into the higher parts of the solar system.
From the Liberian American Committee of Southern California, the Honorable Samuel Hoffman to say some words for us.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. Yeah, I mean, good afternoon. Yeah, stay sleeping. I want to thank the Scheller Institute for having us here today. I'm going to be very brief. I know I had the opportunity to invite Leni to one of our meetings we had back in August, end of August, October, and we thought we had told me some interesting things about what she do and with the LaRouche political network, and she asked me to come over here, and I'm very happy to be here. As you can see, a little bit sleepy, but I'm here. Yeah. You know, as a community-based organization, it's certain things that we are a nonprofit organization, and I'm privileged to talk about, and some things based on our organization that I can't speak on. But one thing I do know that over the last couple of months, since the Ebola outbreak in Africa, especially in West Africa, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, haven't been easy over there. Folks been dying by the numbers, sometimes we see the reports that come out. It's not the actual report that we get from the news, from CNN and across the world. Because when you talk to folks on the ground, which of course we do, the number is staggering, far more than what they report here. But what we have done as a community-based organization, we were able to rally around to get help and support to the people on the ground. But it's come to this. One thing I do know that over the years that the international community, that Africa being underdeveloped, not the whole of Africa, certain countries in Africa, that the financial situation they have to change. It have to change. And how that's going to happen is by we get a complete involvement from the international community. I told Leni yesterday when I spoke to her that yes, the Ebola will come and go, but I think what's killing the people the most is the sense of hopelessness. Yeah, the sense of hopelessness is where do they go after the whole Ebola thing? Where do we go from there? You see, in Africa, we have all these radical groups over there, the Boko Haram and all these folks. When you have sense of hopelessness and folks are poor, they are easily influenced by those groups, and it doesn't help our cause. It only leads to more death and death across the continent. So the United States and Britain and some of the developed countries in the world, we call on them for more help, in terms of trying to send more doctors over there to help us to educate our people. We want more schools on the ground because we believe the more folks we get educated, that the less problem we will have moving forward from our people being easily influenced. And since the outbreak, the United States have done pretty much very well. They were able to make the difference with the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Today we see in Liberia, the cases of Ebola is decreasing. As early as last month, the president was able to lift the state of emergency because of the help of the international community. But I still do believe that there's more to be done. There's more to be done. And the policy, there should be some policy change towards Africa. Some policy change towards Africa. Because if you looked at the Ebola outbreak, it happened in, I was at a conference in San Francisco, and it started back in 1976. And you look at 1976 to 2014, that's almost 40 years, close to 40 years. What's different from 1976 to now? Why haven't they done much back in 76 when the outbreak came to help the people of Africa? Why haven't they done something now? And now that we see, even up to now, they still haven't yet found a cure for the Ebola outbreak. But we will call, once again, I call on the international community, and I'm happy to be here today, that we'll continue to seek the interest of our people and help more folks as not only in Africa, but all across the globe, to help folks all across the globe, especially when it comes to financially and economically. Because you see, when a nation is being deprived so long of financial stability, that can lead to a lot of destruction. And that's what we're seeing across the board in Africa today. That's my presentation. If anyone have any questions, you can take it. And also here with me today is our chairman of the board, the vice president and our former president of our committee. He's here with me also today. If you guys please stand up so that we'll see who you are. Mr. Lorenzo Weeks, Mr. Bernard King, the vice president of our committee, and also Honorable Charles Yasia, the chairman of the board. Thank you guys for being here.
Somebody wants to ask a question, we can take a minute, a couple of minutes. Or we can just, maybe you'll be here for later too.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to take a couple of minutes here to kind of update the situation globally, because Helga's presentation, she did that video about a week or two ago. So everything she said is the same now, but there's been some developments. And I think you can see, as you'll see, the policy that Helga's promoting is a global development policy. We have enough capability in terms of the nations, sections of the globe, and so forth, particularly if we had the United States and sections of Europe involved. The question of African development, the question of Asian development would be a question of the benefit of all, which of course in many ways is the principle the United States was built on. The original Hamiltonian principle was the idea that the scientific progress of any part of a population or any nation in the world held the potential for the development of other nations. These are not property. You know, the striking point is that the American Constitution is based on the principle of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not property. It's not the pursuit of property. If you want to get a chuckle, you'll find out that life, liberty, and property is the statement of the Confederate States Constitution. That was the Constitution of the secessionist section of the United States in the Civil War, which was, of course, the slave-owning section. So for them, property included slaves. That's the uniqueness of the British system that was brought to the United States. We have all kinds of wage slavery, serfdom, but what was unique was the idea of chattel slavery. That is, that the individual on the plantation was owned by the property owner. They didn't have a life. In fact, that was the ruling in the famous Dred Scott decision in 1857, that the slave was not a person. The slave didn't have rights, the slave was property. That, the Hamiltonian approach, and of course, Hamilton himself, along with Franklin, were the leaders of the anti-slavery association in the United States at the point of the U.S. Constitution. So a lot of what you're told about this is mythology. It's not the case that the founding fathers of the United States were pro-slavery. Some of them owned slaves. But in the case of Washington, they were manumitted under his wife. In the case of Franklin and Hamilton, they opposed slavery. And as Abraham Lincoln once demonstrated, of the signers of the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, all but a handful who were Southerners were anti-slavery and proved to be so in their political positions or other positions that they had. So we're fighting really, and you'll see in terms of the Real Development Project, for what could be called an American system conception. The problem is it's not, at the present, the policy of the United States. Now, to give you a sense of what's happened over the last few days that just make what Helga presented even sharper, is, of course, you saw what amounted to an act of political warfare, economic warfare, directed at Russia. To a lesser degree, China, because I think to a large extent right now, a lot of the transatlantic, Wall Street, London axis is a little bit concerned that if China goes economically, the world goes. And that's probably true. But they have a somewhat crazier idea about Russia and other elements of the globe. So what you have had is economic warfare directed against Russia. Now, one aspect of it was the drop in oil prices, as everybody has heard. Now, you have to realize this has been an inexplicable drop. There's been a slowdown in the economy. But the actual cost for most places, for example, to drill and deliver oil, would run about $65 to $85 a barrel. Because you have to remember, transportation is a huge part of the cost. It's not just the drilling. 20% of world maritime trade is shipping oil. Almost 40% is shipping oil and coal. One good reason to go to fusion. But that's what we have right now. So you have the Saudis, who represent a certain wing of the British monarchy. The Wahhabi faction of the Saudis was put in as a ruling grouping by the British at the beginning of the century. And so the Saudis have been pumping about 1.5 to 2 million barrels of oil a day above quotas. And that's really, along with some of the economic slowdown, the basis for a drop in oil prices from $114 a barrel about a year ago, but actually over $100 a barrel as recently as 6 months ago, down to $48 a barrel this week. Now, of course, the basis, to a certain extent, on which the Russians have dealt with the sanctions that have been imposed on them in the Ukraine case, is by looking to the east and exporting energy resources, gas, oil, etc. So this represents a form of attack on the Russian economy. Now, this forced a situation where though mistakenly, because the central bank in Russia is somewhat controlled by monetarists. Kudrin, but also Nabulina and so forth, adhere basically to monetarist policies. Putin is less clear, but people like Sergei Glaziev, who's a leading economic advisor, have already talked about capital controls, exchange controls, and moving away from this central bank-oriented policy. So now we have Russia under the central bank raised interest rates in the beginning of the week to defend the ruble, because the ruble, of course, is being hit by the drop in the oil price. So she raised the interest rates overnight from 10.5% to 17%. Now, as a number of people have said, including Rogozin, who's the deputy prime minister of Russia, you can't live with 17% interest rates. You can't invest in anything productive. The only thing that returns 17% is overnight speculation. And so, of course, this led to a panic about the ruble, that the ruble was going to be collapsing, that it was essentially would massively devalued by the central bank policy. And there was a panic in the middle of the week. By the way, ironically enough, this occurred just as the Federal Reserve announced that they were keeping the zero interest rate policy in the United States. And this caused the stock market to go ballistic because it's purely speculative. There is no physical economy. There's nothing being produced. Now, what this has done in the case of Russia, on top of the Ukraine policy, and make no mistake about it, the Ukraine policy coming from the transatlantic is an effort to force a capitulation by Russia. The idea is that pressed by global, adversity, public international opinion, economic sanctions, that Russia would be forced and Putin would be forced out. There's even been recent talk, even at Putin's press conference on Thursday. It was raised by a Reuters journalist. Well, Mr. Putin, do you trust your inner circle? Mightn't they throw you out of office, or palace coup, or who knows what, because you're the cause of all their problems? So this comes across as a threat. Remember, this isn't a local journalist. This is Reuters. Reuters is a British-based press service. Now, Putin, of course, said this isn't going to happen. We're doing what we're doing for the benefit of the Russian people. But a big part of the miscalculation in the West is that Russia will capitulate. They'll be forced to back down economically. Personally, and I think truthfully, Mr. LaRouche would agree, that's a massive miscalculation. That's a dangerous miscalculation. This is not a matter of dictatorship or aggressive policy or violent policy on the part of the Russians. We know from World War II that if the integrity of Russia in particular, which was that time the largest part of the Soviet Union, but in conjunction with other parts of the Soviet Union, if Russia in particular is threatened with destruction, that as a nation, they will defend their existence with everything they've got. And in this case, it includes nuclear weapons. Now, of course, as insane as the West has become, given that, if that becomes apparent, I wouldn't rule out the West launching nuclear weapons at all. We've got a lot of crazy thinking people out there. People like, Dick Cheney. So we should recognize, apparently yesterday, Putin said that we have a defensive policy, but we will be doing everything necessary to build up our defenses. This includes submarine-launched ballistic missiles, defensive missiles, and so on. Now, what Putin is saying, what Lyndon LaRouche and one of his associates, Glaziev, told the Russians, implement exchange controls. Do what Mahathir did in Malaysia in 1998. Implement capital controls. Belarus did do this, but it's of course a much smaller country. Now Putin hasn't done that, but what he has done is he has said, we will not capitulate. We will defend ourselves. So when Helga says we're on the brink of something awful, that's not bluster, that's not a threat, that's not a political spiel. That's the truth of the matter. And of course, it's classically what empires do at the point of destruction. Now, what we've seen also, of course, and I don't think this is going to go away. We're in this somewhat, you know, I don't want to insult people, but this holiday period is a little weird sometimes. You know, you have Super Saturday in the middle of strategic crisis. You have an economic reading that the economy is recovering because people bought more 2 Saturdays ago. Retail sales are up. You know, people are getting jobs at half the wages they used to get them. And we could go on and on in that vein. But because it's Christmas, people don't want to think about those things. They'd rather stand under a mistletoe or something. Or get a ride on the back of a reindeer or something, you know. Not that your children shouldn't be, but even your children could use a little dose of the real world. Okay? Now, what did we have in the last week or two? We had the torture report, thanks to the backbone for a change of Dianne Feinstein. A rare incident, although she's got a certain toughness to her on certain issues, and this is one of them. And on the issue of torture, she chose to make public the Senate Select Intelligence Committee report on torture, which of course the Obama administration did not want made public. But she did it in the last chance that we had to do it, because with the new Senate, it would not have been released. In fact, the chairman of her, taking over her position, Richard Burr, has said publicly he won't release it. He wouldn't release it. She did. Now, this torture is a human rights violation. Torture is wrong. And a lot of Americans know it. George Washington knew it. Abraham Lincoln knew it. You know, the United States, after the Civil War, was the source of the Uniform Code of Military Conduct. The whole idea of international law acting in cases even of war was commissioned by Lincoln during the Civil War. And in fact, the author of it was a German jurist who had come over and been a supporter of Lincoln in the Civil War. We charged Japanese military leaders with the crime of waterboarding as torture. The issue really isn't ultimately whether there was actionable intelligence. First of all, there wasn't. As anybody knows, torture, if I tortured somebody in this room, I could probably get you to identify 6 people about to blow up this building. And you know, waterboarding might get you to admit all kinds of things. You might even admit to your wife where you've been lately. So torture is not going to get you actionable intelligence. But even if it did, all these, you know, lifeboat stories, what if we're a millisecond away from a nuclear weapon going off in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, and we could squeeze it out of this guy that we're talking to? It's a complete fabrication. There are no such cases. It's not an extreme case. That case is never going to happen. Because you, first of all, won't know it. You won't know, is this the guy with the information? How many people do you torture? Torture is immoral. It's wrong. And the United States has always been against it. And even if we now have a lot of scared Americans who might go with it, that doesn't change the wrongness of it. Even after 9/11, it's wrong. And it's time that, I think what you'll see, as this issue does not die, Because the question is, should Cheney be brought to an international court or a U.S. court for violating international and U.S. law? He knew it. Bush knew it. Now, one of the things we want to do is make clear that Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, and that whole grouping in the Republican Party are a bunch of criminals. And Jeb Bush shouldn't be led anywhere near the presidency. We have Obama to remove and Jeb Bush to keep out. Because you have to recognize the idea that Jeb Bush would be a legitimate candidate even for president is a provocation to most of the rest of the world. Because we know what Jeb Bush represents and the family represents. So we're on politically, this is something that has to be done immediately. We're going to be mobilized to release the 28 pages that have been hidden in the original Senate report on the Iraq War, on 9/11. And we're going to be, there's a whole array of things that will be opening up in the beginning of the year. Also on the economic front, for the first time, and remember Feinstein was going against Obama. For the first time, you had Democrats like Elizabeth Warren, Maxine Waters, and others, Ron Wyden from Oregon and others, saying that it's time we stopped bailing Wall Street out. Because now they've said that we have to guarantee $40 trillion in energy derivatives, energy-based derivatives. Now, why were they so desperate to do that? Because we're on the brink of another collapse. The situation today, the actual financial situation, is worse than 2008. So these will be battlegrounds at the very beginning of the year. Glass-Steagall, as we've campaigned for numerous years, will be back on the agenda as of January the 6th when the Congress comes back into session. So the strategic situation, if anything, has intensified. And at the same time, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Indians have increased their commitment to the World Land Bridge. In fact, the last thing I'll say on the humor side is, if you watch Chinese television in Los Angeles, CCTV or whatever, you'll find out that they talk about completely different things than the American news networks. They talk about the Silk Road. They talk about the development of Central Asia, about the visit to Kazakhstan, about high-speed rail. They actually have discussion of the torture report in the United States that's reasonable. In the United States, we try to bury it. We have news like, Santa Claus sent a letter to a 4-year-old, a kindergartner, and the teacher was happy and everybody was thrilled, and 4 dogs were picked up at the rescue center and fed by somebody, and their hind legs were repaired and they're able to walk again. And I'm practically giving you an actual news broadcast. Well, you'll find that even though they're not against dogs in China, it's not headline news. Okay? So I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to my wife and Debra Gelber. The new Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge. A great infrastructure project, in a sense, covering the same territory as the Silk Road of the 12th, 13th centuries, the road from China across to Europe. That there's a modern version of the Silk Road, which involves the joining of the total capability of the populations of the Eurasian landmass, which of course is the largest landmass on the globe, it's the largest population in the globe, and it portends the greatest development. Now that was the project that Helga Zepp LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche promoted after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s as the counterpoint to the Cold War and to the effort to subordinate the former Soviet republics, Russia, and so on and so forth. That was the peace policy, somewhat in the tradition of Pope Paul VI, peace through development. So this was now stated as the official policy of China about 6 months ago, though this had been percolating for a while. And since then, Helga LaRouche has been interviewed numerous times. In fact, if you go, I think, to the Xinhua or the CCTV website and just punch in Silk Road as the search name, the first half a dozen items that show up are Helga being interviewed by CCTV, the People's Daily News, Xinhua, Global Times, and you know, a number of the broad distribution media of China today. Now, that was followed July the 15th by a meeting of what's referred to as the BRICS. Now, you have to, the BRICS are 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, these 5 countries represent a good chunk of the world population. India and China alone are about close to 40% of the world population. So this represents over 40%, obviously, of the world population. And these are the dynamic, progressive forces on the in the globe today. Now, at that July 15th conference, they adopted that the skill levels that we would like to achieve would be demanded by the development of other countries as they themselves develop their own population. So we are on a, because the world faces 2 things I'll reference just later. I think Helga has this. But the world faces 2 things: the crash of the existing dominant financial system, that is the so-called transatlantic, Wall Street and London, what really is the remnant of the British Empire. You know, to a certain degree, the United States has been recolonized. The second threat, which is a consequence of the first, is the threat of global general warfare or even thermonuclear warfare. Not confrontation, warfare. And I think a lot of Americans just don't, as they say on the street, they just don't cop it. You know, they just don't recognize that these kinds of wars can happen, have happened, and if we don't pay attention, will happen. You can say that the American population, in a certain sense, since the Civil War, that's a long time ago, you know, 150 years ago, and we still have a lot of Confederacy in the United States. But we haven't experienced warfare the way Europe did in World War I and World War II, or Russia in World War II in particular. We don't know what that means. We think it's something that happens 6,000 miles away. And we may offer some sacrifices, but we don't go through the same thing. And now we're faced with the threat of all-out general warfare. Now, if we can avoid those 2 threats, we have something for the future of humanity that it would be the best we've ever done. We're in a position to develop the globe. We have the potential scientific development. We have leading nations in the world committed to it. But we have to get the United States and a good chunk of Europe over the idea that the gains of somebody else is a loss to me. Get over the worship of money. Now, we are circulating a petition, which is also back, but this is being adopted. The BRICS as a whole adopted the Silk Road and even the World Land Bridge Development Project. That this is the unifying principle, not just in terms of infrastructure, but as you'll see later in the day, led by a science driver policy, typified by China and India in their space programs, the venture to the moon, the Indian observer sent to Mars, and so forth. Quite apart from the way most Americans think of this. Probably the most advanced space program in history is now being developed by China, followed by India. Russia is joining in at a certain level. The US space program is degenerating. The fact of the matter is, to put it simply, to Americans, we are no longer number one. Not only in space, but in a lot of areas, but in particular in space. Yeah, we would have a great role to play joined with others. But by ourselves, we simply are not what we once were. So, you know, this policy was adopted as a world land bridge. And I'm going to refer to this, you'll see parts of this. This was circulated, it's called the New Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, and is circulating globally at government levels, institutional, scientific levels, and among the general population to the degree possible. We do also have a pamphlet that's a shorter version that focuses on the BRICS, why the United States must join the BRICS. And we are saying to the American population that the only solution to the collapse of the US economy, the domination of Wall Street, is to adopt this kind of grand, great development project as partners with the rest of the population of the globe, with the leading countries. That is, as Xi Jinping has called it, this is a win-win strategy. It's not a zero-sum game, where if China improves, we must lose. If Russia puts itself together, that hurts us. That's not real development. For us, really, the development of China, of India, of Africa, would represent a benefit circulated internationally. The title of it is "The U.S. and Europe Must Have the Courage to Reject Geopolitics and Collaborate with the BRICS." The first paragraph, "In today's nuclear age, the consequence of the geopolitical policy of confrontation with Russia and China can only be the thermonuclear extinction of the human race. Therefore, every effort must be made to cooperate to solve the multiple crises facing humanity. The BRICS nations have united to pursue a policy of economic development, not just for their individual countries, but for the benefit of all." And I'm not going to obviously read the whole thing. "As patriots of our nation and as citizens of the world, we call on our fellow citizens and the leaders of our nations to have the courage to break the current cycle of escalating bestiality by accepting the generous offer to collaborate with the BRICS." And then it calls, now we do have a number of important signers internationally and in the United States, and we want this to build. This has been posted on websites in China, covered in the major media. It's being picked up on some significant websites in the United States, and we want to spread that. It's worth noting that in Germany, 60 leading German figures, including former Chancellor Schroeder, had an ad in Die Zeit which said, you know, essentially no more wars in Europe. Warning of the threat of war over the Ukraine crisis in that case. So this is not just an alternative, it's an active solution. The one thing I'll underline, it will be covered, this is going on. The rail projects across Eurasia, the space program of China and India. These are not could happen, might happen. They are happening. They are a fact. And the real question is, will the United States have the sense to join them? Now we're going to begin with a musical offering. We'll have music at different parts of the program. We'll start with the musical offering, and then we'll have a message from Helga LaRouche. I'll make some comments after that. We have a presentation by a guest from Liberia, the Honorable Samuel Hoffman, the president of the Liberian American Committee of Southern California. Close. So my name is Phil Rubinstein, and I'll just be moderating with some various comments throughout. And the program, well, first of all, this is part of a series of conferences and meetings across the United States, as well as in South America, Europe, and so forth. For example, sponsored by the Schiller Institute, which was founded by Helga LaRouche on an international scale. Also, you could say co-sponsored by the Political Action Committee, or at least many members of it are involved in this. Now, Helga LaRouche called for this series of conferences internationally. Like today, we have a conference in New York, which is probably our major event of the day. We have a conference in Seattle, up in the Northwest. We have today's conference here, and I believe we have one in Philadelphia. Last week we had other events. Well, the event in Manhattan is actually a sing-along on Handel's Messiah. One of the characteristics of the Schiller Institute is the conception that science and classical art operate on the same principle, the same idea, the same conception, and that all great science is, in a sense, generated by the creative insight of classical art. Typically, the best example is classical music, the music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and a few others. What prompted this series of conferences is that, in particular, in the middle of July, well, two things. Xi Jinping, the president of China, announced that the economic policy of China was the new Silk Road. This idea of a great infrastructure project, which you'll see, it'll be the main presentation of the first panel.